Alright guys, we're going to do a quick lesson now on adaptation. Adaptation is a really simple topic, and I know a lot of you are probably well familiar with it. You are either going to do or you have done a lab involving adaptation, so I just want to mention a few things about adaptation. Alright, adaptation is a physical structure or a characteristic behavior that helps organisms survive in an environment. Here is a prime example of adaptation in action right here in this polar bear picture. Now, I don't know if you realize this, but polar bears are actually not what you think. They're not white. Polar bears are black, and if you look at the polar bear's nose, you can see evidence of that, and if you look at the foot pads, you can kind of see there. The polar bear's skin is black, and this is because dark colors absorb sunlight. Right? So they live at the poles, they need to absorb as much light and therefore heat as possible. So their skin, to do that, is black, and that's an adaptation for staying warm. However, they also need this thick coating of fur in order to stay warm, and so the coating of fur, instead of being white, actually if you pulled off some of these little pieces of fur, you'd notice under a microscope they're actually clear. So that the sunlight, when it strikes the polar bear, can hit the fur, go through the fur, and hit the dark black skin underneath the polar bear's fur to warm the polar bear up. So that's an example of adaptation. And again, this is just physical structure that helps the polar bear survive in its environment. Alright, as we get into natural selection, something that you have to bear in mind is that organisms are born or hatch with their physical characteristics. Okay, nobody evolves them during their lifetime. You're either born with something that helps you adapt, or you're born with something that's what we call maladaptive. So adaptive means it's a good characteristic, it helps you survive. Maladaptive means it's not a good characteristic, it's going to actually work against your survival in an environment. So there's some examples here of adaptations that you see. So the birds, each of them has a beak for a specific food source. So here's a raptor beak for tearing flesh. Here's a seed cracking beak, it's nice and heavy. Here is a filtering beak right here, and so on. So every bird has a beak that's adapted to the food supply that it eats. Okay. Here is a frog, and you can see adaptations. It's camouflaged in its environment. It's got large eyes because it's nocturnal, so the large eyes bring in the maximum amount of light. It's got selective hearing. If you're a frog, you don't really need to hear or see a whole lot. You just need to be able to catch your food. So your hearing and seeing is selective for the food that you're looking for. You've got toe pads that help you stick when you jump around. So again, these are just physical characteristics. Okay, you are born with these, and you maintain them throughout the course of your life. And if they help you survive, we say that's adaptive. If they don't, they're maladaptive. Don't forget also, though, that there is such a thing as a behavioral adaptation. Okay, now behavioral adaptations are slightly different from physical adaptations, because sometimes you can learn a behavioral adaptation. In other words, you can acquire throughout your lifetime. Okay, there are also some, though, which are innate. In other words, they're instinctual. You're born with them. Okay, so here's an example of a hedgehog and its behavioral adaptation. And it says, when startled, a strong muscle in its back will pull it into a ball. Okay, so a muscle in the back of the hedgehog will pull this hedgehog up into a ball, which protects the soft underbelly and points all of these sharp spines straight out. So a hedgehog rolls into a ball, and it's just a ball of these spines, and those spines protect it from any predators. Okay, so that's a behavioral adaptation. Now that's an innate response in the hedgehog. You can have, like I said, with some animals, you can also get learned adaptations. Prime example of that would be chimpanzees using a little thin piece of grass or a reed to get down into a termite hill. They learn how to do that. They're not born knowing how to do that. And then the termites clamp onto that piece of grass, and when they pull it out, they can eat the termites off of it. So that's an example of a learned adaptation. But what you do need to know is that these behavioral adaptations are closely tied with the physical adaptations and structures, okay? So this hedgehog pulling into a ball wouldn't do it a whole lot of good if it didn't have also these physical structures, these spines here, for protection, okay? So that's just adaptation. Hopefully, that's a pretty easy topic for you. We'll get into this more. We'll talk more about adaptations as we get into natural selection next.